Well, welcome back. Another installment of our lectures, video lectures on Galatians. You might remember, perhaps you just finished watching the last lecture, that I decided to turn one lecture into two. I'm just feeling a sense that I don't want to kind of make these long, sort of 40-minute lectures. I'm trying to keep them maybe around 20 minutes. And so I was feeling that pressure, that it would be better to kind of break it up. And so rather than continuing to lecture in that last video, I decided to kind of put a pause on it. So it ended up being kind of a focus on the first 5 verses of Galatians 1. And there's so many things in that first 5 verses. I should have probably known better than to try to fly through it. I just couldn't help myself. I didn't have very good plate discipline. I was thinking, well, I'll just kind of mention some things and get to verses 6 and 7. To the complaint, where I really want to spend our time. And, well, there you go. I burned 20 minutes. So in this lecture, we are now going to come to the complaint section, which begins in verses 6 and following. But I'm actually not calling it the complaint here because I really want to emphasize something that we get from Jens Schroeder's work, and I think it's very important. That's why I wanted you to read it. It probably was a bit of a challenge to work through. Certainly, it had primary language, Greek, and it was originally written in German, so it's an English translation, recent translation of Schroeder's work. Schroeder's a contemporary German scholar, and important German scholar, actually. So recently there's been work to kind of translate some very important recent German work into English, so more people can be exposed to it. And I just think that his argument in this essay that I had you read about Galatians 6 and 7 is fundamental to the work I'm doing in Galatians as we think about Galatians as Paul's manifesto of the ecclesia of the circumcised and the uncircumcised. And so we're going to here just basically outline a couple of big ideas. One, we want to think through carefully the traditional way of understanding Paul's complaint. Kind of what is Paul's issue at heart? What is Paul's issue with what's happening in Galatia? What is he concerned about? Paul grabs the horns of the problem immediately in this letter. In the very opening, he doesn't waste any time. In fact, if you compare Paul's opening in Galatians to every other opening of every other letter we have of Paul in the New Testament, you'll see that Paul sort of does something different here than he does everywhere else. Where everywhere else, after he gives this kind of wish, this grace and peace wish, he often then spends perhaps a few sentences, sometimes paragraphs, in thanksgiving for what God is doing among the recipients. Here, he doesn't even say anything about what I'm thankful for regarding you. He goes right after them, gets right to the meat of the issue, and so we want to sort of get our heads around what the meat of the issue is. And I'm certain that this has not been something you've thought about or have been introduced to outside of reading perhaps Jens Schroeder's work if you've already read it before you've listened to this lecture. And so we're going to introduce you to a different way of reading Galatians 1, 6, and 7, and really then a different way of thinking about the issue that Paul's trying to address in the letter. Let me just give you a synopsis right off the bat so you know where this is going, because some of the discussion in this lecture will be technical. We'll be referencing Greek words, we'll be referencing grammatical constructions, and so the forest might be lost in some of the trees. I promise I'm not going to get too deep into the trees here just because I don't have a lot of time to do that. And I want to be sensitive to kind of where we're coming from and what we're bringing. But just to give you sort of a sense of this, um, the traditional way of reading this passage is represented well, I think, in most modern translations, not least the NIV, the NIV of 2011, that updated NIV. Here in verse 6, Paul says, "I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ." Which is okay. So he's astonished that they're so quickly deserting. They're turning from the one who called them to live in this sphere that Paul names with beauty. Really, I love the way he names it as the grace of the Messiah. You see that in verse 6, the grace of the Messiah there, and so they're deserting. They're leaving behind and turning towards something else. They're leaving that behind. Not that. They're leaving someone behind. They're leaving a person behind. In Paul's view, they're leaving him for one thing, because he shared the gospel, but they're deserting God. They're deserting the one who called them through Paul. So this is of utmost significance, of course. And they're turning now. Now here's the key of all of this. Like what is going on here? What's the problem? Well, for Paul, the issue is they're deserting and they're turning to a different gospel. That's how the NIV translates it. The end of verse 6, a different gospel. And then verse 7 begins with this word which. And which is a relative pronoun. It introduces a relative clause, a clause that whose purpose, whose function is to modify a noun. That's what a relative clause does. And so the different gospel is going to be defined in the NIV translation, and again, this is representative of the kind of the conventional, traditional way of reading it, which is no gospel at all. So what Paul has done is he's asserted that there's this alternative gospel, but immediately after asserting it, not even sort of getting his breath out, he then pulls back and says, well, that's not a gospel at all. So they're turning to a different gospel, but it's not a gospel, okay? That's how that works. And then there's a period, notice there, and then a new thought. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and trying to pervert the gospel of Messiah. So Paul then introduces a category of people who are throwing the Galatian Gentile believers in Jesus into confusion. And also, not only are they confusing them, but they're also perverting the gospel. They're messing with the gospel of the Messiah. So interestingly, these agitators, these confusers, these perverters of the gospel, they are causing the Galatian Gentile believers to potentially desert the sphere of the grace of the Messiah by perverting the gospel of the Messiah. And so you can see kind of grace of the Messiah, gospel of the Messiah. These are phrases that have something of a relationship, because in each case they're connected to the Messiah, the grace of the Messiah, the messianic grace, and the gospel of the Messiah, the messianic gospel. So the logic then, just let's be clear, in the traditional view, is Paul is arguing that some people have invaded or have come from within. We don't know whether they come from within or without, but they have caused confusion because they have perverted the gospel. And their perversion of the gospel, according to this traditional view, is that they're introducing a new gospel, a different gospel. So Paul essentially cannot, in this traditional view, cannot imagine that there's anything but one singular gospel. And anytime someone might be tempted to introduce a alternative or a second gospel, they are perverting it, because they're perverting the singularity of it. So crazy and important as this, of course, is so significant this becomes even more clear how significant, because in verses then 8 and 9, you have Paul doubly calling a curse down on anyone or anything that would mess with the gospel. Okay, so that sounds all very, I guess you might say, orthodox, right? I mean, I don't know until very recently, my own sort of thinking, would I have read this any other way? But that's where Jens Schroeder comes in and suggests that we need to think a bit different about this. Now, what might motivate the thought that perhaps that traditional way of thinking that's really centered on this idea that it's inconceivable that there would be sort of alternative versions of the gospel, since there's only one gospel, okay? Why would anyone think that were not what Paul was arguing here? Why would anyone conceive that there might be something else going on? Well, there's two categories of answer there. Let me just give you the first, and then we'll spend a little bit more time in the second. The first category of answer, why we would even consider that this reading might not be as solid a reading, this traditional one, as we would think, is because Paul is going to say, actually, that there is a gospel of the circumcised and a gospel of the uncircumcised in chapter 2. Look down with me as I move here to chapter 2, verse 7. And we have to actually look at it in the Greek, because the English translation I'm looking at, the NIV, and again, this isn't picking on the NIV, but in general, modern translations will do this. But if you look at 2:7, just to get a context here, Paul is talking about how the pillar apostles, the pillar leaders, James, Cephas, and John, look at verse 9 there, have recognized and blessed his apostleship. And in this context, verse 7 tells us that they recognized that he had been entrusted with the gospel of the uncircumcised, just as Peter was entrusted with the gospel of the circumcised. Now, notice how I read that differently than the NIV translation. The NIV translation says, on the contrary, they recognize that I had been entrusted with the task. See that word task? Task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised. Now, it's important to note that if you go into the Greek here, actually the word task, the words of preaching, and the word to are not in the original language. In fact, what you have here is knowing that I have been entrusted the gospel of the circumcised. So what Paul actually says is that he was entrusted by God with the gospel, the ta euangelion tes akroboustias, the gospel of the circumcised, kathos, just as Petros, Peter, tes peritomes, just as Peter was entrusted the gospel. So we're bringing this verb and this noun in here, inserting it right between Peter and these words, the definite article and the noun circumcised. And so what Paul is saying is that he was entrusted with the gospel of the circumcised, just as Peter was entrusted with the gospel of the circumcised. So in verse 7, if we read it sort of in the original languages, I keep saying sort of, but if we read it in the original language, not sort of, if we read it in the original language, people, what Paul is asserting there is that there are two versions of the gospel, a version of the circumcised and a version of the uncircumcised. Now, this kind of indication would then cause us to at least consider categorically that it's a little bit difficult then to make sense of verse 6 and 7 if we take it to mean that Paul says there can't be other versions of the gospel. There has to be just one. And if there's another version of the gospel, that means that there's a perversion of the gospel. We could offer a bit more evidence to suggest that Paul conceived of different versions of the gospel in this letter, particularly in chapter 3. And there I have in mind, and I'll just mention it here, where Paul says, particularly in 3:11 through 14, that Christ became a curse to rescue us from the curse of the law, so that through that the Gentiles might become children of Abraham. And so in that passage, Paul talks about the application of the gospel differently for the Jew, and we'll develop this in much more detail when we get to chapter 3. But I just want to suggest to you that there in chapter 3, Paul notes the differences between kind of the Jewish significance of the gospel and the non-Jewish significance of the gospel. So we can see in that context that Paul seems to have an understanding of different applications, in that sense, different versions of the significance of the work of Christ. So now going back to chapter 1, then let's kind of take the second category. Not only is there kind of a contextual reason to sort of question this traditional way of understanding, but there's then grammatical reasons. And here I have just a three-pronged sort of point to make about the problems with the traditional reading related to the Greek grammar and the Greek language. The first is the words that are used in this text to describe the gospel: heteros and alias. Heteros and alias. Here, I just again want to reference the Greek. And again, just let me say that I know this gets a little bit detailed when somebody starts getting into the Greek, but I really think it's important that we see this for ourselves firsthand. But notice that, let me just remind you, we're in verse 6. I'm amazed that so quickly you are deserting, you're turning from the one who called you in the grace of the Messiah, and you're turning to a different gospel. You're turning to a different gospel. So here, this word heteron, euangelion, is translated here in the NIV as different. And then you have the word alias in this relative clause that begins with this relative pronoun hauk estin alia, so which is not another. So very briefly, the question I'm asking here is the meaning of heteros and the meaning of Allah. In the traditional way of reading this, you can see that, in a sense, they are taken as synonymous. You're turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel. So the other word here, Allah, which also can mean different or another, is rendered as a negative, which is no gospel at all. And these words, heteros and aliyah, are different ways of saying the word different or another. And so the issue here for us is to ask the question, are these synonymous? Is Paul essentially saying the same thing twice? Once to sort of assert that the possibility of a different gospel, and then immediately to use a different word to assert that there actually isn't a possibility of there being another gospel. Well, the reading of these as synonymous is problematic because of their close placement with each other. They seem to function in a way that is distinctive. The different use of the word then is not simply a stylistic technique, but when heteros and alios are put together like this, it suggests that there is something to the argument in their use. And so what is this significant piece? So we're rejecting that this is synonymous. What makes it important is the way in which these two words play off of each other. And when these two words are used together, what we discover is that heteros references sort of a number, whereas alios names a kind. And so in this case, we need to think differently about the way we translate it. When these are used together, what it means is there is a contrast between a alternative, and that alternative is in contrast to something of a different kind. So Paul seems to be saying that there is an alternative, but it is not different. So the issue is not that there's an alternative gospel. The issue is that the alternative is not different. So Paul seems to assert there is another gospel. And then immediately after asserting that there is another gospel, he then says, but it is not a different gospel. There is an alternative gospel, but it's not a different gospel. So the heteros, alios words seen here again in the Greek, they're turning, or in process of turning, from the one who called them to an alternative gospel. That's how, perhaps, another gospel. Heteron, it would be better translated, not different, but another. They're turning to another gospel. But this is not different. That's how you would translate then the Allah. It's not a different one. So that brings me then to this relative clause that's super important to name here. The relative clause, ha ta estin Allah, which is translated by the NIV, which is really no gospel at all, doesn't actually accurately translate that. The words, which is really no gospel at all, does not translate ha uk estin Allah. Now, there's a lot of times, theoretically, that one has to sort of massage the meaning of a sentence from one language into another. That isn't the critique. You can't always translate literally and make sense of what the original language means in a new language. So that's not the problem. The problem is that it makes perfect sense as it is without having to change the meaning. So the meaning is changed, and the meaning changes not because the grammar suggests it or the syntax, but because there seems to be some other force in translators' minds that's pressing them to translate this another way. That force is essentially the preconceived notion that there can't be alternative versions of the gospel for Paul. But as we've seen in other parts of Galatians, it's completely reasonable to suggest that Paul could conceive of different alternative versions of the gospel as long as they're not different. As long as they're not different. Now, what is Paul then saying? He's saying that these Galatian Gentile believers, under the influence of some troublemakers, have have begun a process of turning their back on God and turning to an alternative gospel. And Paul is asserting that it is not an alternative gospel, except, and now here's what the people have done to the gospel, except some have thrown you into confusion and are trying to pervert it. So the only reason there is a gospel that's alternative that Paul finds problematic is not because in theory there can't be two different versions of the gospel, but rather what Paul is after there is that some have come in and taken a version of the gospel that he acknowledges exists and has twisted it. That's where the conditional clause comes in. E me tenes esin. See, this would not be a problem. Having two versions of the gospel would not be a problem. In fact, we'll argue that there are two versions of the gospel. Paul concedes that there are. The one Peter preaches among the Jews and the one he preaches among non-Jews. Where the problem is that some have come in and have twisted this so that the gospel that was meant for the Jews, the circumcised, has now been twisted to apply to the Gentiles. The Gentiles are being forced, as we'll see, to take up a Jewish way of being that's essentially represented by circumcision. So taking up the Torah, a life oriented and structured by Torah. And Paul is saying that twisting, that perversion, that distortion of the gospel is to be rejected because it has devastating consequences. So let me just sort of put this into as simple terms as I can. And I don't know if you followed this argument, perhaps in part, but the translation gloss here, I think, captures it for us. Here's how I think we should read this passage. You are turning to another gospel, which is not different, except some are stirring up trouble for you and wish to pervert the gospel of the Messiah. So there is a differentiated gospel of the circumcised and the uncircumcised, Galatians 2:7. But those two versions are not different gospels. They're different applications of one gospel, except in the case of the Galatians, some influence has sought to pervert the circumcision gospel and apply it to the Gentiles, which it was never intended to be. And that is putting at risk the Gentile believers' standing with God. So here's how Jens Schroeder summarizes this argument, and see if this makes sense. The argument in Galatians 1:6 and 7 is that the opponents wrongly claim that there is another heteron, legitimate form of the gospel that is materially different from his own. With this, he does not fundamentally deny that there is another form of the gospel proclamation altogether. It is decisive, however, that this other gospel stands on the same basis as his own. Thus, the heteron euangelion may not be an alia euangelion, because it would then no longer be euangelion. The contestation of the unity of the gospel makes the alternative form of its proclamation a distortion of the euangelion to Christu, and thus misleads the Galatians to turn away from God. Thus, Paul is concerned to emphasize the unity of the one gospel in two forms. Thus, Paul is concerned to emphasize the unity of the gospel, the one gospel, in two forms. So, what is the issue then? What is the issue Paul's addressing? The issue Paul is addressing in Galatians that has devastating consequences, if followed through, is that the circumcision gospel is being utilized as a universal gospel. And because of that, there is tremendous pressure being placed on Gentile believers in Jesus to take up not only trust in Yeshua, but also the Torah as the structuring principle for their lives. They are being required to become Jewish and trust in the Messiah for salvation as a part of their participation, as a requirement of their participation in the body of the Messiah. Here's the problem with that. If you do that, if a body were to do that, then no longer would you have the two unique, differentiated groups within the one body. No longer would you have the circumcised and the uncircumcised. If the influencers, whoever they may be, the agitators, if they win the day, the body of Messiah will no longer have the presence of non-Jewish believers in Jesus, because they will all be forced to become Jewish in order to participate. And for Paul, as we'll see, this would be a denial of what he calls the truth of the gospel. And that will be a consideration later in chapter 2, where that phrase is used. Well, this has been a thick lecture, and I trust that at the very least you've kind of grasped the big idea here. And the big idea simply is that Paul's concern is that the Gentiles do not suffer under the influence of this so-called alternative gospel because it will have devastating consequences. But it's not because Paul doesn't envision two different types of gospel. It's because the one type of gospel is a perversion. It's not a true representation of the gospel of the circumcised, because the gospel of the circumcised is for Jewish, ethnically Jewish people, and that's alongside the gospel to the uncircumcised. And together